Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 18, Fredegund vs. Brunhild, the struggle between the Queen Regents. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the assassination of Sigebert had saved Chilperic and his kingdom. Brunhild managed to smuggle her young son Childebert to Austrasia, but she was thrown into an abbey, where she would have most likely spent the rest of her life. However, she received an unexpected marriage proposal from Maurice, the heir of Chilperic. Eager to escape the abbey, Brunhild agreed, but Mauric's revolt against his father collapsed surprisingly easily. When Guntram's two sons died of dysentery, he made Childebert his heir. So, a 7-year-old was the heir to two kingdoms. Well, at least Chilperic had an abundance of sons. Not exactly. Within a surprisingly short period of time, all 4 of his sons were dead, either by disease, suicide, or murder that was supposed to look like suicide. Fortunately, the new region of Austrasia had good ties with Chilperic and proposed an alliance against Guntram. Given the constant fighting between the kingdoms, the Franks had been fortunate that none of their neighbors were strong enough to take advantage of their internal turmoil. The Visigoths had failed to produce a dynasty that could unite the kingdom and expand north across the Pyrenees. Meanwhile, the Lombards did not even have a single king and were divided into numerous independent duchies. To be clear, relations between the Franks and the Lombards were far from peaceful. Particularly aggressive Lombard dukes would cross the Alps to raid Burgundy. Guntram's nobles gained experience fighting the Lombards, and his Duke Momulus proved to be especially effective. The Lombards were able to focus their energy north because the empire was distracted and unable to threaten the disorganized Lombard duchies from the south. However, events were occurring in Constantinople. When Tiberius became co-emperor with Justin, although really under Empress Sophia's guidance, he focused on managing the threats to the empire. The army was strengthened, so he managed to hold off both the Persians and a Slav invasion. Tiberius would have been more effective if he had not been generous on a gargantuan scale in order to buy popularity. Sophia had restrained his generosity, but he gained full control over the imperial treasury when Justin died. Aware that his claim to the throne was very flimsy, Tiberius hoped to imitate Justinian and regain control of Italy. Since imperial forces based in southern Italy had failed to retake Lombard-controlled territory, Tiberius wanted to send an imperial army through the Alps to attack the Lombards from the north. However, Guntram had refused to permit an imperial army to march through his territory, probably fearing that it might try to take control of the passes. News that Neustria and Austrasia were allying was welcome, but they did not seem to be in a hurry to overthrow Guntram. Fortunately, there was another option, Gundovald, who would finally earn the years of free meals, clothes, and accommodation. Apparently, there was widespread support in Greater Frankia for a new regime, understandably, since their current rulers were a paranoid Chilperic, an elderly Guntram, and a boy with a mother who refused to enter a convent. In fact, Duke Boso had traveled to Constantinople to bring Gundovald back to Austrasia, claiming that he would be welcomed by many supporters. Unknown to them, the alliance between Neustria and Austrasia soon fell apart in the spring of 582 because Fredegund was pregnant. When she gave birth to a boy named Theodoric, Chilperic no longer needed Childebert as his heir, but he was happy to invade Burgundy. Bishop Egidius, the regent, and his advisors rode with Chilperic to coordinate the invasion from the west, while the main Austrasian army would march under Childebert and invade from the north. It is worth taking a moment to talk about the army. While the nobles, both secular and clergy, had their household warriors who were paid to fight, the majority of the army were farmers who were forced to leave their farms to serve in the army. They would not be able to work on their farms, and there was a decent chance that they would either become sick with one of the illnesses that always plagued medieval armies, or they would be injured or killed in a battle. Maybe they would get some loot, but they probably realized that any captured estates would be divided among the nobles, so they grumbled. Again, the grumbling was probably standard for large numbers of bored, tired men. However, the grumbling grew, which seems strange since Aegidius's faction was dominant. Gogo was dead, Bozo was in Constantinople, and Wolf was in Burgundy. Brunhild probably had some involvement, but I think it would be dangerous to overstate her involvement. I have no doubt that she encouraged the grumbling, but there were other factors. Wolf may have fled to Burgundy, but many of his supporters had remained in Austrasia, and they unsurprisingly had little desire to risk their lives fighting against people they knew. There was no dramatic mutiny. The soldiers just marched slowly. Very slowly. In fact, the soldiers moved so slowly that the Austrasian army was nowhere near Burgundy when Chilperic and Aegidius began their invasion. Guntram clearly knew that he did not have to worry about an invasion from the north because he led his entire army to face Chilperic. When the two armies fought near the city of Bourges in 583, the battle was a bloodbath, but Chilperic was defeated, or at least forced to negotiate. The two brothers basically agreed some form of peace, while Aegidius and his men rode north to find out what had happened to the Austrasian army. Instead of expressing guilt, the men in the northern army were angry that their fellow Austrasians had died or lost limbs in a pointless alliance. In fact, men openly criticized the alliance since Aegidius seemed to want to make Austrasia subordinate to Neustria. The anger grew until Aegidius fled. So, who would be regent in his place? There were no obvious candidates, so Brunhild became regent. Again, she does not seem to have been especially popular, just acceptable to all factions. Anyway, it did not appear that she would be regent for long since Gundovald had landed in Frankia in September, bringing with him a very large amount of money supplied by Emperor Tiberius. His arrival immediately caused personnel changes as a number of nobles saw an opportunity and joined Gundovald. A key recruit was Duke Mumulus, a senior military leader in Burgundy. However, the invasion collapsed when Gundovald learned that Chilperic was still alive, he had an heir, and Guntram was in solid control of Burgundy. Meanwhile, Brunhild had an unexpected dilemma. The situation was calm in Austrasia, but her daughter's situation was precarious. King Leovigild had given his two sons authority to prepare them to rule while he focused on fighting the Basques. His younger son was responsible for the north, nearer to his father, while Hermangild had been given the south, based in Seville. However, Hermangild had revolted against his father in 579. The revolt had been ignored because Leovigild was busy in the north, and he probably figured that his son was just going through a phase of youthful rebellion. Hermangild's revolt is puzzling since he was the eldest son and would inherit anyway. Admittedly, he had converted to Catholicism, but the conversion had occurred only sometime after the initial revolt. A Visigoth source suggests that Goswintha had clashed with her second husband and somehow convinced Hermangild to revolt, possibly with the aid of Ingund. It seems likely that Goswintha and other nobles resented Leovigild's refusal to share newly conquered lands, and they convinced a rash teenager to revolt. Far from impossible, especially since Leovigild was busy with a war against the Basque. Honestly, the most plausible explanation is that the revolt was a bargaining tactic, but Leovigild refused to bargain, and Hermangild refused to back down. Moreover, Hermangild and his advisors seem to have overestimated imperial support. When Hermangild and Ingund fled Seville for imperial-controlled Cordoba, Leovigild bribed the commander of the imperial force outside the city to let him storm Cordoba. So Leovigild captured the city, and Hermangild sought refuge in a church. After a lengthy standoff, Hermangild left the church and was placed in chains in 584. While Hermangild had avoided execution, it was unlikely that he would remain heir to the kingdom. Recared became the most likely heir, but he was single, So Leovigild proposed a marriage between his younger son Recared and Chilperic's daughter Rigunth. Chilperic agreed until his infant son Theodoric died of dysentery following heavy rains. Suddenly, Rigunth was a more valuable asset. So he made a counteroffer. Basina, his daughter from his first marriage to Odovera. If Basina had viewed the convent as a prison, she would have agreed, but she refused. Chilperic attempted to pressure her, but Fredegund would not cooperate, and she was still too influential to be ignored. Although the empire had failed to gain any territory in Hispania, Emperor Maurice still hoped to regain northern Italy. Wait, who was Maurice? Aware of the need for an orderly succession, Tiberius had appointed a young general named Maurice as his successor in early August 582, and Maurice became his son-in-law the same day. A week later, Tiberius died on August 13, 582. Maurice had good fortune because the Persians were preoccupied with a civil war. Maurice helped Khosrau II win that civil war and received a peace treaty in return. Freed from the burden of an exhausting war against a rival, Maurice was able to direct the army against the Avars, who had been expanding into the Danube region. While the situation had improved, Maurice realized that he lacked enough troops to send an army to Italy. Instead, he sent Gaul to Childebert, who agreed to invade Lombard territory. Since Childebert was roughly 14 years old, Brunhild probably made the decision. The first expedition in 584 achieved little, although the Frankish threat likely helped Authari, the son of a former king, attract enough support to elevate his status from duke to king. Meanwhile, Childebert's sister Ingund and her young son Athanagild had been protected by the imperial troops, but were taken to Constantinople. Brunhild wrote letters to the emperor, some of which survived, and she referred to herself as Queen Brunhild. Maurice was happy to let his hostages go if Austrasia invaded the Lombards, so Childebert marched into Italy again. The second invasion also had little effect, and Childebert soon learned that Ingund had died. Apparently, the news that Austrasia had marched against the Lombards made Chilperic sufficiently secure to send his daughter Rigunth off to marry the Visigoth prince, accompanied by a massive dowry that had been supplied by her mother, showing how much wealth had been accumulated by the queen. The huge procession of nobles, servants, and guards numbered in the thousands, but little arrangement had been made to supply the procession, so the residents of villages compared them to locusts. While the procession slowly made its way to the Pyrenees, Chilperic was murdered one evening after returning home. Again, his guards failed to stop the assassination or even catch the assassin. It is unknown who arranged the assassination. One rumor blames Fredegund, who may have been unfaithful and feared being caught. Other rumors naturally blamed Brunhild. Anyway, Chilperic was dead. Clearly, Fredegund did not feel secure about her future, since she quickly rode to Paris, where she claimed sanctuary from the cathedral, more spacious than a church if you were planning a long visit. This was a wise precaution. There would be a struggle for the throne, especially since Gundovald landed in Frankia in late September 584 after hearing the news. Rigunth's procession stopped in Toulouse when news arrived of her father's death, aware that the marriage alliance had no value now. While the young princess was debating her next move, her uncle Gundovald arrived and gave her assistance. Well, he kindly took charge of what was left of the dowry. Fredegund does not appear to have had loyal followers in Neustria, at least not enough to keep her safe as queen regent, so she sent a message to Guntram that she was his humble servant and she was pregnant. It became a race to see who would reach Paris first, Guntram or Childebert. Guntram arrived first and placed her under his protection. Honestly, the situation appeared to be a gift for Gundovald. The two largest Frankish kingdoms had recently fought a bloody battle. The king of Neustria had died and would be succeeded by a baby. Maybe. While Guntram of Burgundy was old, Childebert of Austrasia was barely old enough to rule. Meanwhile, Gundovald had recruited two powerful dukes, Boso and Momulus. Combined with financial support from the empire, he should have been a serious threat. Except, He no longer had financial support from Constantinople. Generous payments of gold had ensured that Austrasia would help against the Lombards, so Gundovald no longer had any value. To Gundovald's credit, he realized that the conquest of Greater Frankia was beyond his power. Instead, he focused on Aquitaine, where he had grown up in Charibert's court, until his older brothers had decided that he was inconvenient and exiled him in order to divide Aquitaine between them. Also, the timing was good, since all of the main Frankish rulers were preoccupied in Paris, so no one blocked Gundovald as he moved around Aquitaine. Meanwhile, Guntram had found himself the last of the four brothers, and the entire Merovingian project depended on the continued survival of his nephew Childebert. However, there was another option, since Chilperic had a 4-month-old son, Clothar. But the actuarial tables were not promising. Many babies died in infancy. Actually, the main issue was legitimacy, since the timing of Clothar's birth was suspicious. Fredegund had announced that she was pregnant after Chilperic's death, admittedly shortly after, but still after. Determined to ensure the legitimacy of his nephew Clothar, Guntram assembled 3 bishops and 300 Frankish nobles to swear that they recognized the legitimacy of Clothar. As promised, Guntram ensured Fredegund's safety, but refused to give her any power. She was sent to a comfortable home outside Rouen to raise her son, while her old enemy Praetextatus was restored to his former position of Bishop of Rouen. While his concern for his young nephew's future is touching, Guntram was motivated by his own interests, which focused on elevating himself to the position of Overking, claiming that he wanted to relieve the administrative burden on Clothar's advisors. Guntram extended his own lands into Neustria and most of Aquitaine, leaving Clothar his father's original lands along the coastal area of northwestern France. Meanwhile, Gundovald was attracting supporters, helped by the remaining gold from Constantinople's initial investment and a large chunk of Burgund's dowry. Still, money and supporters alone were not enough, or more accurately, he lacked enough of either. It is worth pointing out that Gundovald had found support in Aquitaine, which regularly resisted integration into Frankia, so Gundovald focused his campaign against Guntram. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Guntram went on a charm offensive. Childebert was invited to a public ceremony where Guntram announced that Childebert was his heir. In addition, Tours and Poitiers were given to Austrasia, making an Austrasian alliance with Gundovald much less attractive. Guntram even publicly called Childebert a man, which was probably welcomed by 15-year-old Childebert, but less so by his mother, who reacted by arranging a marriage to a young woman named Falubois, who seemed to have been selected for her docile nature. News that Chilperic actually did have an heir lured many of Gundovald's Neustrian supporters to return north. Since Guntram's army was marching south, Duke Momulus decided to retreat to the town of Saint-Bernard-de-Comminges on the edge of the Pyrenees. Hopefully, infighting between the rival kingdoms would distract Guntram's army north. Unfortunately for Gundovald, everyone in Frankia was tired of civil war. Eventually, Momulus and Gundovald's leading supporters made an agreement with Guntram to preserve their lives and handed over the pretender, who was killed as soon as he left the town's walls, as were Momulus and the other supporters when they met with Guntram, which ended the revolt. To sum up, when a civil war started between the Frankish kingdoms, the empire sent Gundovald to Frankia, hoping that he could claim the throne. However, after a battle between Neustria and Burgundy failed to produce anything other than piles of corpses, the nobles of the respective kingdoms decided that they were not interested in any more fighting. Actually, Neustria soon had its own crisis when Chilperic died suddenly, although Fredegund was pregnant. When she gave birth to a son, Guntram promised to protect his nephew, while taking advantage of the leadership vacuum to claim part of Neustria. Meanwhile, Emperor Tiberius had been succeeded by Maurice, who concluded that it would be simpler to bribe Austrasia to attack the Lombards in order to weaken them sufficiently to enable the empire to reconquer northern Italy. Unfortunately, the Austrasian invasion caused the Lombard dukes to unite behind Authari, the son of a former king. Deprived of imperial support, Gundovald gradually lost followers and was finally executed. So, Guntram was dominant in Greater Frankia. Would he be able to keep peace between the kingdoms? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you like the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.